I'd like to start with a tribute to John Michell. Like many people, I owe John an immense debt. He was one of the people who got me going on the path. And he was probably the first person to recognize the significance of Alexander Thom's work. When he, 2 years after Thom published Megalithic Sites in Britain, John published View Over Atlantis, in which he gave a prominent part to Thom's discovery of the megalithic yard, which is absolutely basic to this stuff, and also John emphasized his devotion to what I shall call proper measure, not metric. Because John wasn't just a romantic, thinking, oh, it's a nice idea to have feet and inches. Far from it. He knew that proper measure, like feet, inches, yards, are totally in a different league from metric. Metric is merely a measure, a practical way of measuring. Proper measure leads you into a new world to do with crystal structure, geometry, an understanding of stone circles, of sacred geometry and sacred buildings in general, in which metric has nothing to say at all. So never think that proper measures are just some silly old fad. They're definitely not. If you want to get into this stuff, they're the thing to work through. John also produced a table which related all the different measures mathematically, arithmetically. So if you start with 1 foot equal to 1 foot square, then you start with a series, starting with a Riemann, which equals 1.48 square feet. Then the royal cubit, equals 2.96 square feet. Right up to the megalithic yard, which equals 7.4 square feet. And you can go right up at intervals, and that's showed that's in City of Revelation. Has anyone read John's book, City of Revelation? Well, it's well worth it if you haven't, because it takes View Over Atlantis a lot further, and this is an example. And that in itself, the very fact that you can do that with all the different measures, to my mind, proves that what I'm saying is that proper measure like this is in a different league from mere metric. I want to go on now to look at a local site just over the wall, the Abbey. Almost exactly 100 years ago, Frederick Bligh Bond was appointed by the Somerset Archaeological Society and the Church to carry out excavations on the Abbey site in 1908. And over the next few years, Bligh Bond published a series of articles in the Journal of the Somerset Archaeological Society, giving a record of his excavations and the discoveries he made. And everything was fine, nice little cosy little corner of archaeology in Somerset, gently pursuing its way. And then he published his book, Gate of Remembrance. And that blew the whole thing out of the water. It caused an immense scandal because in the book he revealed that far from being an ordinary archaeological investigation, all the things that he'd done had been directed by psychic sources through automatic writing. I dare say some of you can imagine the sort of fuss that caused among church authorities. William Temple, who was then Bishop of Manchester and later Archbishop of Canterbury, was editor of a church magazine. In the magazine, he very rashly allowed someone to write an article suggesting that Bligh Bond had reconstructed all his work during the night. So he'd go on site at night, he'd put stones out. In the morning, he'd reveal them as a foundation of a medieval building or whatever. Temple had to publish a retraction of that because there was absolutely no evidence that Bond had done that at all. But the fact was the church couldn't accept it. So Bond was what we now call airbrushed out and disappeared as far as the church were concerned. But he was an immensely, in the same class as Alexander Thom and John Michell, I think. And one of the interesting things about Bligh Bond was that in his book with Simcox Lee, the book Gematria, he writes in an appendix, there must be a yard of 33 inches. What is that yard that he's deduced exists? Well, it's the megalithic yard, because the megalithic yard, according to Alexander Thom, who arrived at an exact measure of 0.829 meters for the megalithic yard, it's the same. 33 inches is just over that. It's 0.829 meters is 32.67 inches. So it's, you wouldn't argue about that. So there you were, 40 years ago, 40 years before the production of megalithic sites in Britain, Bligh Bond, by a simple process of deduction, had realized that, as I've shown there, the megalithic yard is part of a series. If it's not there, then there's a gap. And Bligh Bond saw that gap and said, there must be this yard of 33 inches. So there you are. And no, I don't think anyone else has noticed that Bligh Bond was 40 years ahead of Professor Thom. Is that okay? Yeah. Right. He started with the plan of the Mary Chapel. I expect most of you have been into the Abbey. You know the Mary Chapel, a rectangular building at the West End. And he measured it carefully, and he arrived at measures of 37 feet by 64 feet. Being an architect as well as an archaeologist, he was able to do this job properly. One of the great problems with most archaeologists is they don't know anything else. They don't seem to understand even simple geometry and often seem to think it doesn't matter. But of course, if you're studying things like stone circles, if you don't know any geometry, then you're not going to get anywhere. And of course they don't, because archaeologists are still saying we don't know what Stonehenge is for, things like that. I mean, it's been in print in the last 4 or 5 years. we don't know what Stonehenge is for. Well, you do know, or you can find out, if you know a bit about geometry and astronomy, as, of course, Thom was a great expert. Anyhow, Bond got this very accurately measured rectangle for the Mary Chapel. He then took the diagonal, and because the relationship between 37 and 64 is 1 to root 3, inherent in a rectangle of those proportions, 1 to root 3, is that the diagonal is twice the width. So twice 37 equals 74. Can people all see this? So that was really Bligh Bond's starting point for his work on the overall plan of the Abbey. He took this and made it the basis of a square. And he found that if you used that and applied it to the site, you found that the length of the whole abbey made exactly 9 squares. 9 times 74. And he found that equals 666, which is quite an interesting number. It's not the number of the beast, it's the number of a man. That is the correct translation of the Greek from Revelation. The number of a man. And you'll see echoes of that in a minute. So he took that 74-foot squares. I hope you forgive this rather strange drawing. I mean, I haven't got the square quite right, but the black figure in the middle is EFGH, is meant to be a square. So what he did, he got this square and he put it into the abbey. Now this figure here again appears in City of Revelation, John's book, page 88, taken from a book by someone called T.C. Stewart on the founding of a Hindu temple. And I think that in itself is revealing, because there's Stewart talking about a local Indian Vedic practice where you use this geometry to get the foundations of your temple. You've got exactly the same thing underlying the abbey here. And this is one of the main things about these proportions. They're not local. They are worldwide. Professor Thom thought that there must be somewhere in Britain where megalithic yardsticks were made, which were then distributed over Britain and northwest Europe for the people building stone henges. The one source where they were carefully cutting lengths from an original length, say, of a megalithic yard or a foot. He was wrong. I'm sure he was wrong, because you don't need that. If you use musical proportion, you find that, for instance, an organ pipe, an open pipe of 2 feet length, will give you the note middle C of 264 hertz or cycles per second. And the more accurately you cut that piece of bamboo or whatever, the more accurate that note will be. So if you've got someone with perfect pitch, they can immediately say, well, this piece of bamboo is 2 feet long because it's producing in the middle C when it's blown. When you blow air through it, like you blow it through an organ pipe. Again, musicologists. The Groves, or I think the Groves Encyclopedia, whatever, the music, book on music, says feet correspond approximately to the major scale it's not approximate, it's absolutely exact. The only limit is how carefully you cut the length of your bamboo. Yeah. Yes, I wanted this song. I have to admit it does. I don't know quite why, but the longer the pipe is, the bigger the bore, the bigger the diameter has. Yeah.
I can see at the moment it's 256 hertz, isn't it?
Well, it can be. That's what you call rational downgrading. There are variations because you've got concert pitch and home pitch and things.
264 will be near a C sharp, which is the vibration of the sundial.
It isn't near enough to be sharp. I mean, you could say that concert pitch is sharp because it is sharpening the note. Anyhow, for purposes of this, 264 equals 2 feet. If you want 256, you'd have to shave a bit off the end of your pipe. So it doesn't really matter which it is. The fact is, it's convenient to call it 264 just for simple reasons of mass, of lower and higher proportions. So if you then chop it in half, you'll get a note which is 1 octave higher. If you have a 4-foot pipe, you'll get one that's an octave lower. And one of the things about this, the importance of feet and inches, is that if you take the notes C and D in the C major scale, the ratio between them is 8 to 9. And so that is then, if you take the C as being 2 feet, D then will be 2 foot 3. And so you can see you can work your way up. And I've applied this at Borrowstone Rig Circle, which in Midlothian, a henge there, which Keith Critchlow has followed on in Time Stands Still, republished 2 years ago by Floris. Again, a marvellous book, absolutely seminal, with all Thom's geometry developed. And in those developments, it's quite clear that all the proportions in that geometry can be converted into feet and inches, and therefore into the C major scale. So this illustrates the importance of this and the fact that it's absolutely universal and that it does link you into music, because all these sacred buildings, whether they're henges, cathedrals, temples, churches, essentially they are enormous wind instruments. And I suspect, because I feel quite good about the geometry here, that we're probably in a similar space. But if you take Chartres or any of the Gothic cathedrals, churches, you have there a specific octave which has a unique interval in it, which makes it a unique minor scale. And the Gregorian chant, which is performed in these buildings, resonates harmoniously to the whole building because the building itself has the same proportion. If we have time, I'll have a look at Chartres and you can see them, how every detail, tops of arches, triforium, the base of the roof and so on, all conform to these musical proportions. So that is a characteristic of proper architecture. And dear old Prince Charles, I'm pity he's not here because I'm sure he's sort of fumbling after this, but I don't think he really knows the theory, nor does Terry, the architect he works with. I think they have got a superficial knowledge of it and realise in a dim way that these 18th century houses, say, or whatever, had a good harmonious proportions, but they don't know why. Well, this is why. And if he could just get that together, he'd have a really good basis for his argument. When you talk about places like the Festival Hall and other modern concert halls, whatever, they always have problems with the acoustics for the simple reason that they design the building on the basis of a rational blueprint, which of course doesn't take any account of proper measure or proportion of this sort. So they have to fiddle about with baffles and all sorts of ridiculous things because they haven't got it right. Yeah.
I just wanted to say every sound in this room, it resonates to an F.
So it is a good space. I felt it was.
It's got the main proportions.
Yeah. I felt it was good, and I thought, thank goodness it's here, not the town hall. Because don't tell Alan Gloak, but yes, it's not. The feel is good here. So to go back to this, you take then Stewart's layout, which is based on the Vedic scheme in the Manasara Shilpa Shastra, which Keith Critchlow has a lot to say in Time Stands Still. You start with two fishes, A, B, and C, D, in blue, one at right angles to the other. And where they cross, where they intersect at E, F, G, and H, can you see this? You can see the black square in the middle, E, F, G, H. That's where the two fishes cross. So the fishes establish the square, not the other way around. So you always have to start with the spherical geometry before you get into the more material, physical, in the form, in this case, of a square. That's 74 feet. So E and F, F, G, etc., are all 74 feet long. I shall just have to shout. It won't stay, you see.
It's on now.
So what am I doing? No. Leave it on, yeah. Right, I'll leave it on. So you start with a 74-foot square. Now we come to Gematria, which Hugh mentioned earlier in connection with my book. Bligh Bond and Simcox Lee wrote the great original Gematria, which is based on Greek Gematria of the New Testament. My book's based on the Hebrew Gematria of the Old Testament. And they're similar in that both Hebrew and Greek use numbers, use letters to act as numbers as well. So Aleph, or Alpha, the first letter equals 1, Beta or Beta is 2, and so on. So every letter has a numerical value, and if you just add up the letters in a name or a phrase, you get a number. And in many of these cases, they're important phrases, important names. They have a significance which links them with other things. If you take this word Neith, that is an early name for Isis. So we're dealing with the goddess. If you write it in Greek, you get that 4 letters, Neith, each one with its value. And if you add them, it's 50 plus 5, 15. Oh, I've got that wrong. That should be 8, I think. Anyhow, it all comes out to, it equals then 74. The point being that the number of the goddess's name actually corresponds to the proportions of the square. But even more extraordinary is the fact that 74 feet equals 888 inches. And 888 is the Gematria of Jesus. So you've got, in this one figure, 74, you've got mother and son. And you've got the link, of course, with the cultures between Egypt and Glastonbury. Again, reminding us this is all universal stuff. There's nothing local about it. It's absolutely global. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing I found was when I thought I'll just measure the distances A, B, C, and D, the lengths of the two fishes. And I was amazed to find that they are 153 feet long. So the distance from A to B, C to D, is 153 feet. I wonder if anyone's aware of the significance of that number. That's it. And John, again, of course, has a whole chapter in City of Revelation on this very subject. He takes St. John's Gospel, chapter 21, and he analyzes it. It's the story of Peter and the 6 disciples going out fishing at night. And they spent all night and didn't catch anything. They came on back towards the shore, and there's this figure standing on the shore. It's actually the risen Jesus, but they don't recognize him. Anyhow, Jesus said, well, how'd you get on? And, we didn't catch a thing. And Jesus says, cast your net on the right side. A pun, of course, meaning both the correct side and the starboard side. And when they did that, they caught so many fish they could hardly get to shore. As it says, 153 fishes. Now this again, as Bligh Bond and Lee in Gematria show, is a fundamental number. It sounds a very odd number, but it is actually a very important one. If you look at my cube of letters, the 27 Hebrew letters fit into a 2 by 2 by 2 cube. There's a space for a point for each one of them. You can see it if you look in the book. The point about these 3 numbers is that they refer, 150 and 3, refer to actually specific places in the cube. So you have here, that's the letter Kof, which equals 100. Here in the middle of the cube, right in the center, is the letter, Hebrew letter Nun. And actually, Nun means fish. So again, there's a hint of the fishes that we're talking about, the geometric fishes and the fishes in the net. And that equals 50. And then finally, at this other corner, you have the letter Gimel, which equals 3. So what you've actually got in one sense in the figure 153 is the minimum information you need to make a cube. You can actually make a cube if you know that one is in the middle and the other's at 2 corners. You can turn it down and catch the other 2 corners and then in the sides as well. So if you once got this information, those 3 points, you can go on to make the whole cube. In a sense, you can create the universe. Because, at least in a physical sense, the cube symbolizes the whole 3-dimensional world, which we call, in our innocence, reality. So you can see how important this was, and how the fact it just all links up. You know you're on the right track if it links with other things. if you're working with something like metric, something purely rational, you come to dead end. You won't get anywhere in terms of linking with other branches such as music, crystallography, and so on. Can we have it first? Thanks. This shows the way in which the different measures are connected geometrically. If you start with EF and call that a foot, that means that this big rectangle formed within a fish, which is these two intersecting circles, you can just about see them. Call that a foot. So you've then got RS, NP, making a double square of 2 feet. Then a diagonal of root 2, FS, will give you the Riemann, which, as I showed earlier, is equal to 1.48 square feet. You can then build a square on that of 1.48 square feet. You've then got, within the fish, whose dimensions are short axis EF, the long axis AB down the middle, the ratio of EF to AB is 1 to root 3, and that is the ratio of the foot to the royal cubit, 2.96 square feet. And then you go on to the diagonal of the whole big rectangle from R to P, N to S, and that, on this scale, will be 1 megalithic yard, which we saw was 7.4 square feet. So contained within this composite, this is the sort of the final argument in favour of proper measure, in that you can show how the whole thing fits together within a geometric framework. You can even take it further by putting your compass point at P and drawing an arc with a radius of NP, the width now as a foot, and you get then where it crosses the diagonal at Y, you get a point. You then put your compass point at R and draw an arc which is a radius of RY, and then you get that point Z, and that divides the whole of that side from NR into the golden mean proportion. So that where NZ equals 1, RZ equals 1.618. That's the golden mean ratio. If you look at the proportions of all sorts of living things, everything virtually, and other things that are not living, but if you take, for instance, just your arm, if you take the ratio of tip of your fingers to your wrist in relation to the wrist of the elbow, that ratio is 1 to 1.618. The whole proportions of your face, again, relate to this ratio. Even the vertebrae in your backbone follow the same. Leaves of plants, flowers, and you see this reflected in things like places like Moel-ty-Uchaf, where you've got a stone circle based on a 5-pointed star. Again, of course, the 5-pointed star is essentially the figure for this, because every part of the pentacle has proportions of the golden mean. I wrote to Professor Thom about this because he says at Moel-ty-Uchaf, he says absolutely flatly, they must have arrived at this division of circles into 5 by trial and error. Well, I thought this is totally against everything he was saying about the megalithic culture, which is far from being trial and error. It's all based on a deep understanding. So I wrote to him and said, do you really think it is trial and error? He wrote back, it's trial and error. Full stop. And I thought, how interesting. He was, of course, getting on a bit then, about like me. So he was fairly dogmatic, and he wasn't interested in being challenged, when he was getting on for 80 or something, by someone he'd never heard of anyway. But he wasn't right. As I say, it doesn't fit with the culture at all. They knew what they were doing. But he said they didn't know the maths to divide a circle in 5. No, they didn't need to. A friend of mine had a bit of ground in a nice big garden in Winscombe, just west of here, and he got some really good stones about this high off the hill above on the Mendips. And I said, I'll build you a stone circle. So I built one in his garden, aiming to get a circle divided in 5 with the Gothic ogive forming 2 flattened sides of the circle. And this shows how you can set about this. You start off by getting, this is actually the elevation of the choir at Chartres, but you can use the same geometry for the purpose I used it in the at this garden. You start off with this JKLM, which is again it's the same proportions as the Mary Chapel, roots 1 to root 3, where JM is 1 and JK is root 3. You then extend it down here by taking arcs from up there, so you get an arc across there, and then another arc across there, to get it down to, so that you then have a rectangle which is twice the width. So there you have the next development with the rectangle, with the rectangle extended down to GH. Now you can see there's a lot about this is similar in that you've got the same division of this KG, this long side here, into the golden mean proportion. That then, having got the golden mean proportion, by using this geometry with the arc to there and then another arc to Z, you use KZ, that is equal to 1, where ZG is 1.618. You use that as the diameter of the circle that you're going to put in to form the actual base of your circle, or if it's a Gothic cathedral, the shape of the roof. Charpentier, who did a lot of this work at Chartres, shows that if you take this to be the elevation of Chartres Cathedral, the floor of the nave here, and the basis of the ogive, the roof, at K and L here, if you then extend that where the dotted lines are to P and Q, where it cuts this circle, you find that if you take that to be the bass note, the floor, the next octave is, again, as we saw before, is twice JM, to give you the next octave. And then, as he said, Charpentier said, you then go into another octave, which takes you up to P and Q, where these sides cross the circle, and that is a fourth in the next octave, a musical fourth. That then gives you the basis on which to get your ogive, your flattened sides, based on the circle which we got just now. So there's the next stage, where at the top you can see K and L are the spring of the arch of the roof. You can see the circle, which has a diameter, as we saw, of 1 in the golden mean ratio. And it's that which determines where the bottom points of the star are. One thing that Charpentier doesn't say, and I'm not sure it's simply he didn't know, or he didn't want to say perhaps, he doesn't actually tell you how you get the bottom points of the star. He just says it's based on a musical fourth. He doesn't say how you achieve it. Well, you achieve it by simply taking where these long diagonals go from J to L dash, M to K dash, where they cut the circle at S and R and S. Those are the bottom points of the star. The top point is in the center of the vertical going through E and O, right down the middle. And again, where the circle cuts the sides there of the skull, that is where the fourth and fifth points are. So that's the basis of the Chartres ogive and of the circle that we made at Winscombe. So all you need to know, if you're making one, and I wish Tom was here now, Professor Thom, because I could demonstrate, I proved it, as I say, at Winscombe, because you only need a peg and a line. The person doing the work wouldn't need to know all the theory, as long as they know about 5 or 6 steps, where to put the peg, how to use the line. You arrive at eventually your stone circle at the top with its 2 flattened sides, making the ogive, without actually having any knowledge of the theory at all. So it doesn't have to be trial and error, it doesn't have to be modern maths. And all these, I'm sure all these, the masters of geometry, the great masters directing all this work, they knew it, but the chaps on the work site, on the floor, wouldn't have known this at all. They would just go from one to another. In a sense, it's intuitive. And it makes you see how pathetic drawings, architectural drawings are when they're based on blueprints, on mere metric rationalism. There's nothing wrong with being irrational. The important thing is to get them in balance, rational and irrational. The modern world's terrified of anything irrational, because it doesn't understand it. And that's part of our problem. We need to get them into balance. So I'm all for irrationality, provided it's balanced by the opposite, by rational. Now we come to Luxor in Egypt, 18th dynasty temple. And this is the inner temple at Luxor, the covered temple, based on, it's a drawing of Swallow de Lubitsch's, who wrote Le Temple de l'Homme, which was published in Cairo in 1949. There is an English translation, I think it's by it's an American company who now published a single volume. The original by Swallow is 4 volumes, make a pile about that high, of which one is entirely of text and drawings. And this is one of the figures from, I think it's volume 2, the covered temple at Luxor. You can see if you look carefully, I've put in the golden mean ratio again, because the covered temple forms a 1:2 rectangle in which the width is 1 and the length is 2. Measured in megalithic yards, it's 44 by 88. And there again, of course, you have an example of the megalithic yard occurring. Some are quite different in the 18th dynasty Egypt. It also occurs in the Great Pyramid, and Ivan in The Sphinx and the Megaliths, published about 1973 by Turnstone. Again, he spots this in the Great Pyramid. And you notice how the key points, particularly there, are in key points in the geometry, which I've put in on top of the plan. But the really important thing here is, if you look at the top edge, that is the southwest end, the very most innermost part of the temple. It's divided by a line etched into the stones underneath the flags. There's an etched, chipped line running what Swallow calls the axis of measures, running down the middle. And if you measure that line from the point C at the top to S, Swallow noticed that made what he called 10 fathoms. As with Charpentier, they're unfortunately French. It's a tremendous handicap being French, or not being British, shall we say, because they never heard of proper measure. I mean, they're totally into metric. So it's tremendously difficult for them to even grope towards what we call proper measure. But at least Gerald Swallow realized that he got 10 fathoms there. And if you look at 10 fathoms, equivalent to 720 inches, 60 feet, 30 yards, and most important of all, 22 megalithic yards. So in that datum, there you've got the datum laid out in the foundations of the temple, giving you all the key measures. And that then, of course, gives if you double it, to give the full width of the temple, that gives you your 44 megalithic yards and then your 88 for the length. I need to hurry on, don't I? There's a lot more to be said, but I want to really get on to this last one. I think this perhaps is the most interesting, because, for one thing, it's a church in Paris, Saint-Sulpice, which is near where the old Les Halles market was, gone now. People think they've never heard of this, certainly in this country, and yet anyone who read the Da Vinci Code has read it, does know it, because if you can remember, if you've read the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's book, he describes the villain going into this church of Saint-Sulpice, and he knows there's a secret there somewhere on the floor. And he starts to look, this copper strip going across the floor of the nave of the church. And he's getting on, and then he sees a nun up in the gallery, and he goes and murders her to make sure the secret doesn't get out. And anyhow, he just knows there's a secret, but he doesn't know what it is. So there you are, a church which people don't think they've ever heard of, because they think the book's all made up. Dan Brown, in this case, took a perfectly true, solid church as part of his story. The thing about this is that, first of all, the church was built, they started it in 1743. Now, that's incredibly late. I mean, it's well post-Renaissance. And yet, when I looked at the feet, the measurements in feet for what is, in a sense, a 2 by 1 rectangle again, in which the width at this point is half the full length, with this gallery added later, which doesn't count. If you translate those measures of feet, which are published in a guidebook, translate them into megalithic yards, and you've got a rectangle of 72 by 144 megalithic yards. Now, this is not just a Christian building, but it's so late in time. And of course, 144 is also a Fibonacci number. That is, it's a golden mean number. If you then start looking at a man called Frank Marie, who published a book called Étude Critique, he gives golden mean proportion for every part of that plan, starting with the round Mary Chapel at the top. The internal measurement of that chapel at the top is 13 megalithic yards. Well, that's a Fibonacci number in which it's made up of adding the two previous ones, 5 and 8 make 13. 8 and 13 make 21, 21 and 34 make 55, and so on. So each number is arrived at by adding the previous two, and these are all golden mean proportions in which, as you go up the scale, get more and more accurate, but they never actually get there. It's like pi. Pi, you can go on putting more and more numbers after the decimal point, you never get to a naught. Equally with this, as you go up, it goes from side to side, getting closer and closer to the exact measure, but it never actually gets there. Anyhow, there's Frank Marie giving all these proportions based on 13. 21, 34, 55. He didn't know about megalithic yards. And he never gives a single measurement. He gives the ratios, he doesn't give the measurements. But when I started using a megalithic yard and applying him to his proportions, there they are. All golden mean proportions expressed in megalithic yards. So it confirmed what I thought. It is based on megalithic yards in the most detailed way. That's only the start, because down here in the south transept, there's a little roundel of blue glass, which through the year, noon sun shining through that little blue glass, traces a path across the nave into the north transept, where we have what the French call a gnomon, which is the Greek word, and we call a sundial. So here you have the sundial in the north transept. It gets, perhaps in October or November, it gets to the base, and as you go towards the winter solstice, the noon sun gradually climbs up until it reaches the ball on the top at the winter solstice. So you've got this extraordinary arrangement on which you could say the Paris meridian was founded. We think the meridian should be the Greenwich meridian. Well, again, it's just a rational thing. The Paris meridian is founded on, as I say, on the noon sun's path across this church, which is picked up again in Bourges Cathedral, where there's another copper strip across the nave at Bourges. It then links up with 12 churches down in the Aude, right down near the Pyrenees. A whole ring of 12 churches, medieval at least. So this must be, this path, this Paris meridian is at least medieval, far earlier than the wretched Greenwich thing, and probably, well, I'm sure it is prehistoric. And it's been picked up in this church. And I think that's absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that even though it's been shoved under our noses, people still haven't got the message. I hope people here have today.